Can good exist without God? Well, it depends on how you define good. Is good defined by God, or is good defined by something else? Let's see what William Lane Craig has to say.
Do the gods will something because it is good, or is something good because the gods will it? If you say that the gods will something because it's good, then the good is independent of the gods. It's not dependent on them at all. But if you say that the good is whatever the gods will, then that seems to be an example of might makes right. They could have declared something totally different to be the good, and so it makes good and evil arbitrary, which seems wrong. And this dilemma is often pressed against those who believe that goodness and moral value is grounded by God. I think, however, that the Euthyphro dilemma is a false dilemma because there's a third alternative. It's not the case that God's will something because it is good, nor is it the case that something is good just because God wills it. Rather, God wills something because He is good. That is to say, it is God's own nature which determines what is the good. God is by nature essentially compassionate, just, fair, kind, loving, and so forth. And because He is good, His commandments to us reflect necessarily His nature. And therefore, the commandments of God and our moral duties are rooted in God's essence. They are not arbitrary. They are rooted in God Himself, but they aren't grounded in anything external to God. God is Himself the good, who is the source of our moral duties.
So essentially, Craig's saying that morality is defined by God's nature. So when Craig says that objective morality exists, what he's really saying is that God's nature exists, because they're the same thing, according to him. So now let's look at his moral argument for God.
Premise one, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Two, objective moral values and duties do exist. Three, therefore, God exists.
Okay, so if we replace objective moral values and duties by what Craig means by objective moral values and duties, which is God's nature, then the new argument looks like this. Premise one, if God does not exist, then God's nature does not exist. Premise two, God's nature exists. Conclusion, God exists. So baking the question is a logical fallacy where you assume the truth of the conclusion within the premises. And that's the problem with this argument. You can't say that God exists because God's nature exists. That's circular. For me, the definition of morality that makes sense is just desire. So when I say that health is good or torture is wrong, all I'm saying is that I desire health and I do not desire torture. People might then say, oh, so if someone desires torture, then torture must be good, right? To which my answer would be, yes, it would be good for them, but this is definitionally true. You would agree with this as well based on my definition of good. In the same way that if we said God's nature was to torture, then torturing would be good. But that would be definitionally true. And both of us would agree with this based on that definition of good. So the moral argument ultimately comes down to how you define morality, and the theist would need to give a non-circular definition for morality in order for the argument to work. But the problem is, if you give a non-circular definition, then that would mean that morality would exist outside of God, which would then mean that you can have morality without having God, which completely defeats the argument. So that's my take on if you can have morality without God. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching.